My name is Verity Alcott. I am 29 years old. Last Tuesday, the man I called Dad stood in the middle of my office, surrounded by the professional life I had built with my own hands, and looked at me like I was a mistake he needed to correct. He had a lawyer with him, a man who smelled like expensive cologne and empty threats. They had court paperwork in their hands, legal claims that aimed to strip me of everything my grandfather had left me. My father gestured to the papers as if he were handing me a gift. "We are just managing things for your own good," he said. "You are young Verity. You are emotional. You need us to make the smart decisions." I did not scream. I did not fight. I looked at the lawyer, then I looked at my father, and I realized he had no idea what he had walked into. That morning the Kansas wind was rattling the windows of my office, but inside I felt nothing but a sharp, cold clarity. For years I had been the spare child, the one who wasn't academic, the one who wasn't the golden heir. I had spent nearly 3 decades trying to earn a seat at a table where I was never meant to belong. I had built a career as a financial manager, earning a salary that let me stand on my own, while my parents continued to treat me like a child who couldn't balance a checkbook. But my grandfather Silas knew better. He saw the structure of my mind, the way I mapped out patterns, the way I protected the things I loved. He knew their greed would eventually turn toward the inheritance he had spent a lifetime building. My father waited for me to apologize, to fold, to cry, to beg for their approval. He was still waiting for the little girl who wanted her name on a school ribbon. He didn't know that I had spent months preparing for this exact encounter, cataloging every lie, every dismissal, and every attempt they had made to minimize my existence. The judge would ask for the estate records in just a few days, and when they opened that folder, their entire world was going to come crashing down. They thought they were the architects of my future. They were actually just the demolition crew for their own. Before I take you back to how this all started, take a second to like and subscribe to Still Drama Stories if this sounds like the kind of justice you need tonight. Drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Now let me tell you about the house I grew up in, the house where I learned that a name on a family tree doesn't guarantee you a place in the shade. It was a colonial in Wichita, manicured to the point of hostility, where my sister Bethany was the sun around which my parents orbited. I was the moon pulling tides they never noticed reflected light, they never credited. I spent my childhood watching them celebrate her mediocrity, while I sat in the corners of dining rooms doing math in my head, calculating how much harder I had to work just to be considered average. By age 12, I had stopped asking for help with my dyslexia, realizing that to my mother, Diane asking for support wasn't a need, it was a character flaw. I taught myself to read the world in diagrams. I taught myself to see the systems behind the furniture and the architecture of the deals my father bragged about over wine. I became a ghost in my own home, a financial manager of my own survival, hiding my true capabilities until I could finally escape the performative cruelty of that house. I thought I had left them behind for good, but greed has a way of finding you even when you have built a life made of steel. The living room in my Kansas apartment was usually a space of quiet order, where the only movement came from the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. But today the atmosphere felt stifling as my parents occupied the sofa like scavengers circling a fresh kill. Silas and Diane sat side by side. Their posture perfectly mirrored their faces' masks of performative concern that I had known my entire life. They did not mention the man who had sat in these very chairs just months ago, sharing stories of the Kansas dust and the pride he took in the land. They did not speak of the way he had nurtured me when I was a child, hiding from the chaos of their expectations in the local library, or the way he had pressed a hand to my shoulder during my graduation ceremony. Instead, they spoke of liability and risk and the management of assets they had no right to touch. Diane smoothed the fabric of her skirt, her movements sharp and precise. She told me that since I was unmarried at 29, I clearly lacked the stability required for serious financial stewardship. It was a blatant insult to my professional reputation. I am a financial manager. I move millions of dollars through portfolios that secure the futures of families who actually trust one another. I stood my ground, my voice steady as a heartbeat. I reminded them that I managed multi-million-dollar portfolios for a living, that my life was built on the very foundation of asset management they were suddenly pretending I could not understand. They did not listen. They laughed a hollow sound that seemed to suck the warmth right out of the room. It was the same laughter they had used when I told them about my dyslexia when I was a child. It was the sound of a verdict rendered long before the trial began. My phone buzzed against the mahogany surface of the coffee table, interrupting the silence. I glanced down and saw a message from my sister Bethany. She had not reached out since Grandpa Silas passed. The text was short and venomous. She wrote that I had always been the emotional one in the family, that my attachment to the estate was nothing more than a desperate grab for attention to compensate for my lack of personal success. It was the classic Bethany maneuver, hitting below the belt while playing the role of the rational sister. I let the phone sit there. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me tremble. My father Silas leaned forward, his presence filling the space with the weight of decades of expectations. He pulled a letter from his briefcase, claiming it was Grandpa's final wishes. He insisted that the accounts be transferred immediately, that I was acting as a rogue agent against the family interest. He called it a gesture of peace, but his eyes were hard as flint. He wanted me to sign a document that would strip me of my agency and hand control over the inheritance to him and Diane. It was a power play, plain and simple. I looked at the letter. It was written on stationery Silas would never have touched, let alone owned. The ink looked too fresh, the signature too hurried. My father had reached a point of desperation where he was willing to forge the legacy of the man he had only ever seen as an obstacle. I felt the pulse in my wrist jump. This was not about managing money. This was about erasing me from the narrative of my own life. I looked at my parents, and for the first time, I did not see authority figures. I saw people who were so terrified of losing their status that they were willing to tear their own family apart to maintain it. I picked up the letter from my father's hand. I read it slowly, letting him think I was intimidated by the legal jargon he had surely paid someone a great deal to assemble. I knew the structure of a trust. I knew the difference between a directive and a demand. I felt the paper between my fingers, feeling its texture and weight. It was an offensive document. It was a breach of everything Silas stood for. The room felt incredibly small, and the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like a countdown. I needed to move them out of my home. I needed to breathe in a space that wasn't contaminated by their greed. I told them I would look at the document, but that I needed 24 hours to review the terms with my own legal team. Silas looked as if I had suggested we walk to the moon. He told me that my own lawyer would only complicate a simple family resolution. He said that bringing in an outsider showed how little I cared about family honor. Family honor. The words felt like sandpaper. I walked them to the door, feeling the relief of the deadbolt clicking into place as they stepped out into the Kansas twilight. I was alone again in the silence of my apartment, and the air rushed back into my lungs. I sat down at my desk and pulled up the encrypted file where I had been keeping the digital copies of everything Silas had left me. I found the scan of the trust. I read the clauses aloud to myself just to hear how the law sounded when it was on the side of justice. The trust was designed to be a wall. It was meant to be the final word that Silas had prepared for a moment just like this. However, my phone lit up again. It was a notification from the local bank branch manager. My parents had arrived there in person, attempting to subpoena my entire account history under the guise of an emergency investigation. They were trying to get ahead of the trust. They were trying to manufacture a scenario where I was insolvent or under duress. My stomach tightened. They weren't just attacking me in my living room. They were moving to cut off my supply lines. I stood up and paced the room, thinking about my next move. The bank would need a formal response from my attorney by morning. I called the lawyer Silas had suggested I keep on retainer for this exact scenario. His name was Elias, and he was a man who understood the value of silence and the weight of the law. He answered on the first ring. I told him what they had done. I told him about the subpoena attempt and the forged letter. He didn't sound surprised. He told me that the subpoena would be denied, but that my parents were clearly setting up a motion for an emergency asset freeze. They wanted to tie up the accounts so I could not use the inheritance to fight them. The game was becoming more dangerous with every passing hour. I realized that my father had no intention of stopping at a meeting. He was going to use every legal lever he could find to exhaust my resources. I had to decide if I was willing to engage in a protracted battle that would drain not just my bank account but my soul, or if I should find a way to end this before it destroyed the firm Grandpa had helped me understand from a distance. The thought of losing the control I had fought so hard for made me cold. I had worked too many nights and studied too many complex asset structures to be bullied by a man who couldn't even manage his own household without looking for a scapegoat. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. The dark roast filled the apartment with a familiar comfort. I watched the city lights flicker to life across Wichita. I knew the trial was looming, and I knew the evidence would eventually come to light, but the path between now and then was littered with traps. I stared at my reflection in the window glass. I looked like my grandfather, the same set of the jaw, the same refusal to be rattled by the noise. I was ready to face them again, but this time I was going to be the one holding the gavel. I opened my email and began drafting a response to the bank that would shut down the parents' request once and for all. It was the first step in a sequence that would eventually leave them standing in court, realizing their narrative was not just wrong, but dead on arrival. The process server arrived at my office on a Thursday morning, just as I was finishing a complex valuation for a commercial real estate firm in Chicago. He was a man with a tired face and a thick folder that seemed to drag his shoulder down. He did not look at me with malice. He simply performed his job. I signed the electronic pad and watched him walk away toward the elevators, leaving the heavy envelope on my desk. The weight of it was immediate. I sat down and pulled the pages out, feeling the sharp edge of the paper cut into my skin as I unfolded the document. In Realcott Estate, management was written across the top in bold black letters. The petition was extensive. They were suing for full conservatorship over my inheritance. I began to read the justifications, and the language they chose was designed to dismantle my credibility systematically. My parents argued that the immense pressure of my position as a financial manager was a direct symptom of what they called my long-standing mental instability. They suggested that my professional success was merely a facade for a fragile psychological state that rendered me incapable of handling a multi-million-dollar estate. It was an insulting fabrication that hit deeper than their usual coldness because it weaponized my own accomplishments against me. They were using my work ethic as evidence of my decline. I flipped to the bottom of the petition to see who had authored such a distorted picture of my life, and I saw the name Marcus Thorne. I knew of him. He was a shark in the legal community, notorious for taking predatory probate cases where he could bully heirs into settling for pennies to avoid the public exposure of their private lives. He did not look for justice, he looked for leverage. My heart rate increased for a moment as the reality of the situation took hold. They had brought in a specialist in destruction. My hands wanted to shake, but my training kicked in with the automatic precision of a practiced reflex. I opened my digital calendar and created a new file labeled Estate Defense. I started documenting everything. I noted the time the process server arrived, the exact language used by Thorne in the petition, and the names of the partners who had signed off on the filing. I was no longer just a financial manager balancing ledgers. I was the primary asset in a war they had declared on my autonomy. I did not call my parents. I did not call Bethany. I turned my attention to the screen and began reorganizing my own internal defense strategy. My internal peace was interrupted by a light tap on my glass office door. It was David, a senior analyst I had worked with for 3 years. He walked in carrying a stack of files, looking more hesitant than I had ever seen him. He closed the door behind him and kept his voice low. "Verity, I think you need to know something." He hesitated for a second, then continued. "Two of your parents were down by the security desk about 20 minutes ago. They were asking the head of security for your work history. They were trying to verify your employment status and asking if you had been involved in any disciplinary actions or financial improprieties." I felt the air in my chest turn to ice. They were trying to get me fired. They were trying to manufacture a record of incompetence that they could then submit to the court as supplementary evidence for their conservatorship claim. It was not just about the money anymore, it was about destroying my career. If they could get me terminated, they would have the perfect narrative to present to the judge that I was a liability not just in my personal finances, but in the workforce at large. I thanked David for the heads up and asked him to keep it quiet. He gave me a supportive nod and left the room. I waited until he was out of sight, then picked up the phone to call Elias. Elias was the attorney I had mentioned earlier, a man who viewed the law as a chessboard rather than a battlefield. I laid out the situation clearly, including the security desk incident. I needed him to understand that this was not a dispute between family members. This was a calculated campaign of harassment. Elias listened to every detail without interrupting, and when I finished, his response was calm and decisive. "They are desperate," he said, "because they think you are going to fold under the pressure of the lawsuit. They are attacking your job because they want you to lose your income so you cannot afford to defend the estate." Thorne is the one who suggested this tactic. He operates on a contingency fee model, which means he only gets paid if he secures a settlement from you or forces you to relinquish the inheritance. He is betting on a quick settlement because he does not want to put in the time for a full trial. That realization shifted something in my perspective. The lawsuit was not a sign of their strength, it was a sign of their financial anxiety. They were overextended, they were likely drowning in debt, and they needed that trust to bail them out before the creditors came knocking. Thorne was just the hired gun trying to facilitate a fast transaction. I asked Elias what we should do, and he told me that we had to make the lawsuit so expensive and so time-consuming for them that Thorne would eventually lose interest. We had to turn their predatory tactics back on them. I spent the remainder of the afternoon working on a comprehensive audit of their recent financial activity that I had already begun putting together. My parents were not just greedy, they were negligent. I had proof that they had defaulted on loans and had been juggling debt for years. If I introduced this into the court record, not only would it destroy their claim of being responsible guardians, it would force their own creditors to pay attention to them. I was going to turn the spotlight on their house of cards. My phone rang again, but I didn't recognize the number. I answered cautiously. It was a man identifying himself as a representative from a regional bank where my father had previously held credit accounts. He sounded anxious. He asked if I was aware of the pending litigation involving the Alcott estate because their bank had been contacted by Marcus Thorne regarding my late grandfather's accounts. I told him I was represented by counsel and would have my lawyer reach out to him directly. After I hung up, I realized that Thorne was going door to door, trying to freeze everything I had touched. He was a wrecking ball, and he was hitting every structure that bore my name. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that for every action, there was an equal and opposite reaction. If they wanted to play a game of financial brinkmanship, I would show them how the game was actually played in Kansas, where the legacy of a man's word is respected above all else. I looked at the photograph of my grandfather on my wall, the one where he stood in a field of wheat looking toward the horizon. He had told me once that the hardest part of harvesting was not the cutting, it was the threshing separating the wheat from the chaff. I was currently in the process of threshing my life. The conflict was no longer limited to my apartment or my office. It was expanding into my professional network and my relationship with the very institutions that enabled my life. The pressure was mounting, but for the first time, I felt a strange sense of exhilaration. I had been underestimated my entire life, but no one had ever tested my mettle in a field I actually controlled. I opened my legal folder and started preparing the motion to block Thorne from interfering with my professional accounts. Every step they took toward me was a step they took toward their own eventual discovery. I watched the clock and waited for the next move in a game they thought they were winning, but were actually already losing. The sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the office, and I knew tomorrow would be even more complex, but I was ready for it. I had the facts, and I had the resolve. The lawsuit was just another layer of the conflict, and I was already looking for the layer beneath it. Grandpa Silas was a man who lived by the rhythms of the soil and the uncompromising integrity of the plains, where a fence line marked the boundary between what was yours and what belonged to the world. He was never a man of grand gestures or hollow promises, but he possessed a deep understanding of the structural value of protection. Before he passed away, he spent many long afternoons with me in his workshop, not talking about the volatile ups and downs of the stock market or the flashy real estate deals that my father obsessed over, but about the quiet concept of safety. I remember him sitting in his worn leather chair, his hands resting on his knees, and saying, "Verity, put your trust in what cannot be shaken." He told me that in this life, people would always be looking for a way to claim the fruit of someone else's labor, and that the only way to prevent that was to build a structure so solid that no amount of greed could permeate it. At the time, I thought he was just being philosophical, a grandfather passing on abstract wisdom to a girl who was still struggling to find her footing in a world that expected less from her than she had to give. I did not realize that he was providing me with a map for my future. Now, with my own life under siege by the very people who should have been my primary supporters, I returned to the workshop. It was a space that still held the scent of sawdust and old oil, a ghost of his presence that brought a familiar ache to my chest. I spent hours sorting through the private records he had left behind, stored in a dusty blue trunk tucked into the back corner of the space. Every item was a piece of him, a ledger from the 70s, a collection of rusted tools, and finally at the very bottom, a singular heavy document encased in a protective plastic sleeve. It was a certificate of irrevocable trust. He knew. He had seen the way my father operated, the way my mother prioritized appearances, and he had acted long before I even understood the danger I was in. My concentration was fractured by the persistent ringing of my phone. I pulled it from my pocket and saw the name of my bank manager, a man named Greg, who had handled my accounts since I moved to Wichita. I answered, expecting the usual routine inquiries regarding my personal investments, but Greg's voice was clipped and uncomfortable. He informed me that Marcus Thorne had successfully served a subpoena on the bank, demanding my entire account history for the past decade, under the broad allegation of financial fraud. The accusation was designed to create a cloud of suspicion around my professional history. They were trying to paint me as a woman who had somehow dipped into funds that were never hers to begin with. The bank was legally obligated to acknowledge the subpoena, but they were giving me a heads up to prepare my defense. I felt a surge of heat behind my eyes. This was no longer just a legal dispute. It was an attempt to assassinate my character by framing my career as a series of illicit transactions. I told Greg that I would have my attorney file a motion to quash immediately and that he was not to release any information until the court issued a direct order. My training in asset law screamed for a calm, methodical response. I needed to isolate the fraud allegation and demonstrate its absolute lack of merit. I hung up the phone and stared at the certificate of trust in my hand. I sat back down on the floor of the workshop and began to study the fine print of the document. The language was beautiful in its precision. It was not a suggestion, it was an absolute barrier. It established that every asset Grandpa Silas had accumulated from his land to his private investments had been placed into this trust years ago. As I navigated the clauses, I realized with a sudden jolt of electricity that it did not just protect the capital from inflation or mismanagement, it explicitly named me as the sole autonomous beneficiary. There was a clause that specifically addressed the potential for parental interference. It stated in no uncertain terms that no guardian or biological relative could hold power of attorney or administrative authority over these assets for any reason, regardless of my age or marital status. It was a surgical strike against my father's greed. Grandpa had built a legal fortress that effectively barred them from even touching the gate, let alone the vault. I felt a sense of clarity that I had not experienced since the day the lawsuit arrived. They were spending thousands of dollars on a lawyer and pouring their energy into a campaign of harassment that was destined to fail because the very thing they were fighting for had been rendered untouchable. The weight of the realization was profound. My parents were not fighting me. They were fighting a ghost who had anticipated their every move and outmaneuvered them from beyond the grave. I realized that my father's confidence in the courtroom was built on the assumption that I would be terrified of the scrutiny. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to worry about public exposure because he assumed I had things to hide. He did not realize that I had spent my entire life being the most honest person in the room because the truth was the only thing that had ever saved me. I began to construct a timeline of what to do next. I needed to present this trust to my legal counsel immediately and make sure the court was aware of its existence before the parents could get another word of misinformation on the record. But I also knew I had to be careful. If I showed them the trust now, they might try to claim that Grandpa was not in his right mind when he signed it, which would force me into another long battle. I needed to wait for the exact moment when they were so deep in their own deception that they couldn't retreat. I looked up at the rafters of the workshop and spoke softly to the empty air. "You really did think of everything, didn't you, Grandpa?" I felt a strange sense of comfort knowing that he had protected me in the most practical way possible. It was not just emotional support, it was the hard concrete of the law. I decided I would keep the trust hidden for a little while longer, allowing them to continue their charade of the concerned guardians while I gathered the rest of my evidence. They would be forced to make their public claims in front of the judge, and they would be forced to swear to them. Once they were on the record, and once their lawyer had committed to the fraud of accusing me of mental instability, I would introduce the trust as the final evidence that they were not concerned guardians but desperate thieves. The strategy was surgical. It was the kind of approach that required patience and the willingness to let the enemy believe they were winning until the very second the floor dropped out from under them. My sister Bethany sent another text message, this one a link to a local news article about the legal filing they had made against me. She commented that it was a shame it had to come to this, but that I had left them no choice. I did not respond. I simply blocked the thread and deleted the notification. The noise they were making was a distraction, a way to keep me from focusing on the structure of the defense. I was finished with the performances and the emotional theatrics that defined my childhood. I had the trust I had my work, and I had the absolute certainty that their time of manipulating my life was coming to an end. The Kansas evening began to darken, and I stepped out onto the porch to watch the stars appear over the plains. There was a stillness in the night that contrasted with the chaos they were trying to inflict upon me. I knew the coming days would be tense, but I also knew that the battle was already won on paper. I just needed to survive the act of the trial. I turned back inside, closing the door on the cooling air, and started to write the summary of facts for my attorney. Every word was a brick in the wall I was building between me and my past. I felt the steady confidence of someone who had already seen the conclusion of the story. The ambush they were planning would turn into the very thing that ensured their permanent exit from my life. I went to bed early that night knowing that the following week would be the definitive turning point in our family history, and that I would be the one to dictate the pace of the conflict. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I did not dream of lawyers or courtrooms or broken fences. I dreamed of the work I would do when this was finally over. The path forward was clear, and the legal ambush they had initiated would be the very mechanism that dismantled their power for good. I sat up in bed and realized I had forgotten to check my email one last time. A message from my firm's executive partner flashed on the screen, informing me that my parents had called the office again demanding an audit of my professional performance. They were doubling down, and it was time for me to provide my final response to the board. I knew the path ahead required a level of cold precision that my family had spent years trying to suppress in me. They had spent my entire childhood convincing me that my mind was a muddled, disorganized thing because I struggled with reading text on a page, but they had never understood that my brain functioned like a high-end operating system. I decided I would play by the rules of their legal game, but I would do it with superior data. I reached out to a forensic strategist, a woman named Sarah, who specialized in tracking the movement of assets and exposing the inconsistencies in financial filings. She was not the kind of lawyer who liked to hear herself speak in a courtroom. She was the kind who could find a single digit out of place in a mountain of corporate records. I brought her everything. I provided the history of the wire transfers, the mortgage payments, the investment accounts, and the proof of the trust Grandpa Silas had sealed months before his passing. We built a file that was not just a defense, it was a roadmap of their financial desperation. The meeting with my parents was a tactical necessity. They requested a sit-down at a sterile, neutral cafe downtown, ostensibly to discuss the lawsuit, and try to convince me to accept a private settlement before the discovery phase began. I agreed because I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to go. When I walked in, they were sitting at a corner table, looking remarkably self-important in expensive clothes that clearly exceeded their actual means. They were banking on the inheritance to fix their crumbling finances, and their smugness was so thick it was almost suffocating. They expected me to break down under the weight of their accusations. They expected me to look at their designer suits and their confident posture and realize that they were the adults, and I was still the child who had no right to question them. I sat down and ordered a black coffee, keeping my face entirely blank. I offered no reaction to their condescending remarks about my professional life. Instead, I took out a notebook and started asking them to confirm the contents of their legal filing under oath. I went through every paragraph of the conservatorship petition, asking them to verify the specific claims they had made about my professional history and my grandfather's mental state. They were blinded by their own greed. They didn't see the trap I was setting. They happily walked through the lies they had built for the court, believing that each word they spoke was securing their victory. I left that meeting feeling a sense of calm that I had never known in their presence. They had no idea they had just provided me with a transcript of their perjury. I walked out of the coffee shop into the bright Kansas afternoon air and took a deep breath. I was done being the victim of their expectations. I was ready for the deposition. I was barely 3 blocks away from the cafe when my phone pinged with a message from Bethany. She had clearly been waiting for the meeting to end, and now she was making her move. She suggested we meet at a local coffee shop for a quick chat. It was a transparent tactic. She wanted to catch me while I was still reeling from the meeting with our parents and manipulate me into admitting that Grandpa Silas had been senile when he signed the trust. I walked into the shop and found her sitting at a small table near the window. She had that wide-eyed, innocent look she had perfected in high school. She told me that she was worried about me, that she didn't want to see me lose my reputation in a long, drawn-out court battle. She claimed that Grandpa had been confused in his final months, that he had signed papers he didn't understand. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Verity, if you just admit that he was declining, I can get Mom and Dad to drop the lawsuit. Think of the peace it would bring to the family." It was a trap wrapped in the guise of compassion. I looked at my sister and remembered every time she had stolen my thunder as a child and how she had never once held my hand when I was struggling. I smiled a thin, humorless smile. "You are asking me to lie about the man who was the only honest person in our lives. I'm not asking for your permission. I am asking for your cooperation," she insisted. "Bethany, you aren't asking for my cooperation. You are asking me to be the mechanism of my own destruction." I stood up and left her there with her half-empty latte and her scripted worries. The encounter only confirmed that I was surrounded by a network of people who viewed reality as something that could be molded to fit their bank accounts. I returned to my office and found an email from Marcus Thorne, the lawyer representing my parents. The deposition date was set for the following Tuesday. He was incredibly bold in the message, suggesting that if I didn't come prepared to sign a settlement agreement, they would be forced to seek an immediate court order to seize control of my assets, pending the final verdict. It was a direct threat to my financial livelihood, designed to force a response before the judge could see the truth. I looked at the date on the calendar. Tuesday was 4 days away. I knew that I had exactly one chance to dismantle their case before it ever reached a jury. I needed to ensure that my presentation was flawless, that my documentation was bulletproof, and that Thorne had nowhere to hide when the truth finally arrived. I spent the weekend in my office surrounded by the evidence that Silas had left behind. Every time I felt a flicker of doubt, I looked at the trust document. I thought about the hours I had spent with Silas in the wheat fields, listening to him talk about legacy. He had known that a legacy was not just money, it was the character of the person you left it to. He had chosen me because he knew I would not let the wolves tear it apart. I knew that the deposition would be the hardest day of my professional career, but I was a financial manager. I dealt in risk analysis, and this situation had a very high probability of success if I played my cards correctly. I was calm because I had prepared for every variable they could introduce. I wasn't fighting for the money, I was fighting for the truth of our relationship. On Monday night, the night before the deposition, I received a call from the head of the firm where I worked. She sounded hesitant. "Verity. I received a strange inquiry from a legal representative asking for information regarding your internal performance reviews and any history of financial disagreements with the partners. My father and Thorne were going scorched earth. They were not just trying to take the inheritance, they were trying to ensure that I would never work in finance in Kansas again. I listened to my boss and realized that the conflict was no longer limited to the court of law. It was permeating every aspect of my identity. I told her the truth about the lawsuit and the family harassment. She listened and told me to keep my head down and not worry about the job. She trusted my work, she knew my results, and she saw through the pettiness of the accusations. That was one less boulder to carry. I spent the remaining hours checking my files for the 10th time. I had everything indexed and organized. I had the transcripts from the coffee shop meeting with my parents. I had the text from Bethany, and I had the records that proved my parents' financial neglect and their recent attempts to interfere with my employment. Thorne would walk into that room thinking he was going to dismantle a young, inexperienced woman, and he was going to walk out realizing he had been the one on trial the whole time. I closed my eyes and visualized the courtroom as a boardroom where the numbers always tell the truth. Everything was ready. The stage was set, and I was finally ready to stop being the target and start being the witness to their ruin. There was only one final step to complete before Tuesday morning. I picked up the phone to coordinate the final piece of evidence, which I had saved for the final reveal. I knew that once I played this card, there would be no going back to the way things were, but that had been true the moment they filed their first petition. I was ready to face the music, knowing I was the one holding the baton. The conference room at the downtown law firm was refrigerated to a point that felt deliberate, an environment designed to make the participants uncomfortable and impatient. I sat at the mahogany table, my hands resting calmly on the leather surface, while Marcus Thorne leaned toward me, his eyes scanning my face for a crack. He was a man who lived for the intimidation factor. His suit was sharp, his posture aggressive, and his questions were structured to entrap rather than inquire. He started by probing my professional history, attempting to frame my rapid rise as a financial manager as a series of lucky gambles rather than the result of rigorous discipline. He used a mocking tone when referencing the asset law I practiced, suggesting that a woman my age in a high-pressure field was inevitably suffering from chronic burnout and executive dysfunction. I answered every single one of his inquiries with the surgical precision of an accountant reviewing a ledger. I did not hedge. I did not get emotional. I provided data-backed facts citing specific case studies and financial performance metrics that proved my professional stability was beyond reproach. Thorne became visibly frustrated by my lack of reaction. His attempts to rattle me were falling flat against my wall of neutral factual responses. He was accustomed to people who cracked under the glare of his spotlight, but he had never interrogated someone who treated a deposition like a standard quarterly audit. Then it was my father's turn to take the stand. Silas walked to the chair with the practiced gait of a man who believed he was the most important person in the room. He sat down and immediately began to weave a narrative that was entirely disconnected from the reality of Grandpa Silas's final months. He painted a picture of a broken daughter, someone who had supposedly been spiraling into a severe depressive episode while secretly manipulating a dying man into signing away the family fortune. My father was a good actor. He knew exactly when to pause for effect and how to pitch his voice to project paternal suffering, but he was also remarkably sloppy. He lied about the timeline of Grandpa's health, claiming that Silas had been suffering from acute dementia during the very weeks he was busy teaching me the fundamentals of trust management. I felt the urge to jump up and correct him, to list every lucid conversation and every sharp observation Grandpa had made during those days, but I held myself back. I let him dig the grave deeper. I took notes as he spun his web of deceit, ensuring that every fabrication was on the public record. My attorney Elias sat beside me, his pen moving effortlessly across a legal pad, capturing every word for future use. The temperature in the room seemed to rise as Diane became increasingly unable to restrain herself. She watched her husband's performance with a mixture of pride and impatience until she finally erupted. She stood up her chair, screeching against the floor, and pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. She screamed that I was betraying the family legacy, that I was a parasite feasting on the success my father had built, and that I would regret the day I chose to defy them. Her outburst shattered the veneer of legal decorum that Thorne had been trying to maintain. She was shouting about legacy while the reality of her own actions was slowly being dismantled by the very evidence we were accumulating. The court reporter stopped typing, watching the display with a look of bored observation. Thorne tried to signal for her to sit down, but she was past the point of listening to reason. She called me an ungrateful wreck of a daughter, a woman who had never deserved the name Alcott. I sat there watching her lose control, and for the first time in my life, I felt no pain. I only felt pity. She was a woman who had built her entire sense of self on a foundation of appearances, and now that those appearances were fraying, she had nothing left but rage. Once Diane finally sat down, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Thorne realized he had lost the control he craved, and he decided to pivot to his final, most aggressive tactic. He stood up and announced that based on my alleged instability and what he labeled as suspicious financial behavior, he was going to file an emergency asset freeze request with the probate court. This was the threat. He wanted to tie up the trust funds and my personal brokerage accounts so that I could not pay for a robust legal defense or continue to operate my firm. It was a direct attempt to force me into a financial crisis, hoping that the prospect of being unable to pay my own bills would drive me to settle for whatever pittance they were willing to offer. I looked at Thorne and saw the desperation he was trying to hide behind his legal maneuvering. He knew the case for conservatorship was weak. He knew the facts were not on his side, so he was going for the throat. He was trying to push me to the brink, hoping that the sheer stress of losing my liquid assets would make me fold. The financial crisis was not just a hypothetical, it was a real and immediate danger to my firm's operations. If the court granted an emergency freeze, my business accounts would be locked as well, because my parents had argued they were intertwined with the estate. I felt the first real spike of tension in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe slowly and evenly. This was what they wanted. They wanted to see the financial manager lose her nerve, but I had spent my entire adult life planning for market corrections and black swan events. I had a contingency plan for every situation, including this one. Elias caught my eye and gave me a microscopic shake of the head, signaling that we were ready for this specific move. We had a motion ready to be filed simultaneously that would demonstrate the freeze would cause irreparable harm to a thriving business and dozens of innocent employees. Thorne had overplayed his hand by attempting to target the commercial entity itself. He had crossed the line from a probate dispute into a professional tort case. The deposition concluded shortly after that. Thorne left the room without making eye contact, and my father walked out, trailing his tail like a whipped dog. But Diane took one last look at me and whispered that I would be living on the street within a month. I didn't respond. I walked out to my car, and for the first time since the lawsuit started, my hands were absolutely steady. I checked my phone and saw that the bank had already reached out regarding the preliminary freeze motion Thorne had sent their way. I knew the next 24 hours would be a whirlwind of filings and counterfilings. The escalation was now total, but I had the documents. I had the facts, and most importantly, I had the knowledge that the people who raised me were so blinded by their own greed that they didn't see the trap they were building for themselves. I started my car and drove out of the city parking lot, watching the sun dip behind the distant hills of Wichita. I knew exactly what was coming next, but I was prepared to meet it with the calm of someone who had already calculated the final outcome. The question now was how much further they would go before they realized the assets they were trying to steal had been locked away forever. The quiet of my apartment in the aftermath of the deposition felt less like a sanctuary and more like a staging ground for the final act. Kansas culture is built on the bedrock of plain-speaking honesty, where a man's word is his legacy and a contract is as sacred as a Sunday sermon. My parents had spent decades cultivating a reputation of high standing in Wichita, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the landscape they were operating in. They viewed law as a flexible instrument they could bend to their will through social pressure and the weight of their own self-importance. I knew better. I understood that beneath the surface-level politeness of our community lay a deep and abiding respect for the cold, hard truth of a documented agreement. I spent the next several nights poring over the Kansas statutes on trusts and estate law, feeling the paper between my fingers like the pages of a textbook that finally made sense. I was not looking for loopholes. I was looking for the structural integrity of the trap Silas had built for them. The law was firmly on my side, but I needed to ensure the court understood the profound distinction between the empty performance of family honor and the reality of familial exploitation. I began to draft a personal affidavit. It was a difficult process because I had to translate 29 years of lived experience into the clinical objective language of the court. I detailed the years of emotional neglect, the specific instances where my professional and personal growth were treated as inconveniences rather than triumphs, and I contrasted this with the professional and deeply loving relationship that Grandpa Silas and I had cultivated during the final decade of his life. I wrote about the Sunday afternoons in his workshop and the way he had mentored me not as a subordinate, but as a partner. I described how he had intentionally shielded me from the corrosive influence of my parents' demands because he saw in me the same architectural mind that had allowed him to build his own empire. I wrote until my wrists ached and my eyes burned under the harsh glare of the desk lamp, ensuring that every sentence was calibrated to show the court that this was not a dispute between an unstable daughter and her guardians, but a deliberate theft of a woman's autonomy. The first logistical crisis arrived with the morning mail. My phone rang with an automated alert from my primary financial institution. My bank accounts had been temporarily flagged by the court order Marcus Thorne had pushed through in a desperate attempt to create a liquidity crisis. It was a calculated move to prevent me from being able to pay my legal fees or operate my daily life. The logistical nightmare began almost instantly. My rent payment was rejected, my utility bills were put on hold, and the credit cards I used for my firm's operational expenses were suspended. It was a direct hit. Thorne had successfully leveraged the court's initial caution to create a situation where I was forced to scramble just to maintain my basic standard of living. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline as I logged into my banking dashboard and saw the words pending review next to my core assets. This was the moment where a less prepared person would have panicked. This was the moment where the stress would have forced them to call Thorne and beg for a settlement just to get the lights turned back on. I stared at the screen for a long time, taking deep, even breaths. I had anticipated this move. I had already diverted a portion of my emergency fund into an external account that was not tied to the estate trust, nor connected to the institutions Thorne was targeting. I was liquid. I was safe. But I had to decide how much of the truth I wanted to leak right now. I spent the next hour documenting the freeze and the resulting disruption to my business operations. This was a critical piece of evidence. By flagging my operating accounts, Thorne had effectively committed tortious interference with my professional business interests. He was no longer just litigating an estate case, he was actively sabotaging a legitimate Kansas enterprise. I gathered all the communication from the bank and the details of the rejected payments and sent them to Elias. I told him we needed to move for sanctions against Thorne for targeting assets that were clearly outside the scope of the original conservatorship claim. I was hitting back with the same level of aggression they had displayed, but I was doing it through the formal channels of the court. That evening, I received a message from my mother. It was not a phone call or a handwritten note, but a short, cold email that demanded to know if I was ready to talk about a settlement yet. She claimed that she and my father were concerned about my mental health and were willing to pay for a private facility where I could rest until the estate was settled. It was a final attempt to frame me as a medical ward in front of the judge before the case could progress to a full hearing. They were terrified. They knew that the longer this went on, the more likely it was that their own financial records would come under the scrutiny of the court. They wanted out now. They wanted to take a portion of the inheritance and go back to their comfortable lives in the suburbs before anyone asked why they had been so eager to strip their own daughter of her rights. I stared at the screen and realized I had a massive decision to make. I had to choose whether to settle to make the pain and the financial chaos go away or to stand firm for the legacy I was meant to protect. It was a pivotal moment. If I accepted a settlement, I would be safe and wealthy, but I would be letting them walk away with their reputation intact and their lies unchallenged. If I stood firm, I would be risking months of public scrutiny and the continued assault on my professional standing, but I would be ensuring that their actions were exposed for what they were. I walked over to the blue trunk, where I kept Grandpa's original tools, and touched the leather of his old work gloves. He had built a life on the premise that you do not compromise with people who seek to undermine your foundation. I realized that my own dignity was the most valuable asset I had ever managed, and it was certainly not something I was going to liquidate for a quick payout. I sat down and wrote back to my mother's lawyer. I did not mention the trust. I did not mention the affidavit. I simply stated that I would not be entering into any negotiations until the court had reviewed the full evidentiary record. I sent the message and turned off my phone. The house was quiet, but the air felt charged with the electricity of the coming confrontation. I had chosen to stand firm, and the implications were now set in stone. The trial would move forward. They had wanted a fight, and I was going to ensure they got a fight that left no room for their version of reality to survive. I stood up and paced the small space between my kitchen and my living room, thinking about the courtroom. I could see the judge's face in my mind's eye, and I could see the exact moment when the parents would realize they had overplayed their hand. Everything was prepared. I had done the work. The only thing remaining was to survive the last few days of their manufactured chaos before the final reveal destroyed everything they had been trying to build. I moved toward the window and watched a patrol car drive slowly past my apartment block. Life in Wichita continued on as if nothing were happening, but I knew that the foundation of my entire world was shifting. I grabbed my coat and headed out toward the office to ensure the final batch of documents was perfectly indexed. I knew the parents were likely huddled in their own living room, planning their next move, but they were fighting a war of attrition while I was fighting a war of facts. I was done with the uncertainty. I was ready to see how my father's face would change when the judge finally read the truth of the trust into the official court record. I stepped out into the night, and for the first time I realized I was not the victim of this story. I was the one directing the ending. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of absolute focus that bordered on the transcendent. My office became a war room where the only currency that mattered was cold, hard proof. I took the bank statements and arranged them into a chronological ledger that would be impossible for any reasonable judge to ignore. Beside the financial records, I laid out the letters Silas had written to me over the years, letters that documented his growing awareness of my parents' predatory intentions. Every email where he hinted at the existence of the trust was flagged and tagged. I was not just assembling a defense, I was constructing a complete history of their systematic exploitation. I had spent my entire youth trying to be the daughter they wanted, but I was currently functioning as the financial manager they had inadvertently trained. I was no longer the frightened girl who looked at the floor when my mother spoke. I was a woman who understood the precise market value of every move they made. I indexed every page and bound the files in heavy-duty folders that felt substantial in my hands. The work was therapeutic because it transformed the chaotic trauma of my upbringing into a logical sequence of events. When you look at an injustice through the lens of a balance sheet, the emotional noise fades away, and you are left with the arithmetic of betrayal. I looked at the mountain of paper I had produced and felt a surge of confidence that surprised me. I had finally realized that their approval was a debt they had no intention of paying, and I had stopped trying to collect it. The minor conflict that broke my concentration came when I was digitizing the final set of personal effects from the blue trunk. Tucked inside the lining of a small leather wallet I had overlooked earlier was a tiny digital recorder, one of those old-fashioned devices that felt like an antique in our world of cloud storage. I turned it on and pressed play, expecting perhaps a reminder about the farm or a list of household repairs. Instead, I heard the gravelly voice of my grandfather recorded on his very last day of life. He was speaking to someone not in the room. He was talking about me. He said that he was weary, but he was at peace because he had finally locked the gates. He used the specific phrase, protecting Verity from the wolves. I froze as the audio continued. He spoke about the trust not as a financial instrument, but as a shield he had hammered out of his own life's work to ensure that his predatory children would never have the satisfaction of consuming what he had saved for me. It was the most intimate piece of evidence I had ever encountered because it was a direct confession of his intent. I sat in the chair listening to his fading breath punctuated by the quiet resolve in his words. It was no longer just about the money, it was about his love for me and his total lack of illusions about the people who had raised me. I spent the evening making a high-quality copy of that audio file to be delivered to the court. Just as I was finishing the upload, my phone lit up with a notification from the probate court clerk. Marcus Thorne had filed an emergency motion to suppress the trust documents. He claimed they were inadmissible hearsay and that they had been procured through duress or by someone who lacked the capacity to form legal agreements. It was a panicked play. He had caught wind of the existence of the trust documents and was trying to prevent them from becoming part of the public record. If he could convince the judge that the trust was a product of manipulation rather than a deliberate estate plan, he could get it thrown out and revert the inheritance back to the default state laws, which would favor the parents as next of kin. Thorne was a shark, but he was a shark who knew he was running out of water. He was attacking the legality of the document because he knew that if the judge actually read the trust, the entire lawsuit would be revealed as a baseless extortion attempt. I immediately called Elias to coordinate our response to the motion to suppress. His voice was grim but determined. "They know they're losing," he said. "This motion is a Hail Mary pass. If they can't suppress the trust, they can't sustain the lawsuit." I told him I had the new recording, and the judge would see it as the clearest possible proof of Silas's state of mind. Elias told me to hold the recording until the hearing because he wanted to catch Thorne off guard during his cross-examination. He wanted to force Thorne to make a formal argument against the validity of the trust before we introduced the recording that would prove Thorne's theory of the case to be an absolute fabrication. We were building a trap that they were walking into willingly. I spent the final night before the trial going over the presentation one more time. I sat at my dining table and looked at the stack of folders. My parents thought I was a girl who couldn't read, and my father thought he was the only one in the family who could read the bottom line. They had absolutely no concept of how much I had studied. They did not understand that I was an elite financial manager who spent her life analyzing the risks of every venture she entered. I had identified the risk in my own life, and I had mitigated it before they even knew the war had started. The house was quiet, but my mind was vibrant and sharp. I had spent my entire childhood feeling like a mistake, and my entire adulthood trying to fix that feeling through work. Now I had the chance to fix it through the truth. I set the files in my leather bag and stood up, moving to the window. The lights of the city felt like stars caught on the horizon. I was not afraid of the court of law. I was not afraid of Thorne's predatory tactics. And I was certainly not afraid of my parents anymore. The moment they stepped into that courtroom, they would lose the protection of their reputation because reputation is something you build while integrity is something you live. They had lived their lives in the shadows of their own ego, and I had lived mine in the light of my work. The contrast between our realities would be the most devastating piece of evidence presented. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a glass of water, knowing that sleep would be elusive, but that the clarity of my position was a better rest than any amount of shut-eye. I reviewed the final list of attendees for the hearing. A few family friends were expected to show up. They were people who had been fed the story that I was unstable and desperate. I looked forward to seeing the expressions on their faces when they realized the woman they had been mocking was the one holding the keys to the kingdom. Thorne was going to try to paint me as an unhinged daughter, but I would present as a calm and focused executive. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I had to remain the professional I had built myself to be while they allowed their own entitlement to destroy their public standing. The pieces were in place. The trust was solid, the recording was backed up, and my resolve was absolute. I stood in the center of my living room and felt a sudden weightlessness. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for permission to be successful. I wasn't waiting for Silas or Diane to look at me and tell me I had finally made it. I was already there. Everything they tried to do to suppress my life had only ended up clarifying my purpose. I checked the lock on my door and turned off the lights, ready to face whatever they brought to the courtroom. I was not the victim of this story anymore. I was the person who was going to close the book on them. I picked up my bag and headed toward the door for the morning I had been waiting for all my life. I had the facts on my side, and for the first time that was more than enough to silence the wolves that had been circling me for years. I stepped out into the hallway and left the apartment knowing I would never again be the person who walked out of that house with my head down. The sky over Wichita was a bruised purple as I pulled into the parking lot of the county courthouse. The morning air held the sharp bite of a late autumn chill, a perfect reflection of my internal temperature. I stepped out of my vehicle wearing a charcoal-tailored suit I had purchased specifically for this day. It was not a garment chosen for fashion, but for armor. I walked toward the heavy stone steps, feeling the solid concrete beneath my heels. My heartbeat was remarkably slow. For weeks, my parents had been broadcasting a narrative of my supposed mental decline, painting me as a fragile woman, incapable of managing her own life, let alone a massive financial estate. Today, I was going to let them choke on that fiction. This proceeding was no longer simply about protecting financial assets. It was a terminal breach of family honor, a line drawn in the Kansas dirt that could never be uncrossed. The Midwestern culture I grew up in values a person doing exactly what they say they will do, and my grandfather had promised to protect me. I was here to ensure his final word remained an unbroken promise. The security checkpoint was a blur of metal detectors and bored deputies. I passed through with the efficiency of a corporate executive arriving for a hostile takeover. My attorney, Elias, was already waiting near the elevators holding his briefcase with a quiet, relaxed posture that immediately reassured me. We rode up to the 4th floor in silence, the mechanical hum of the elevator serving as the only soundtrack to our final ascent. When the metal doors slid open, the reality of the situation hit me like a physical force. The corridor outside the probate courtroom was packed to capacity. My parents had mobilized the entire extended family, turning a private legal matter into a public spectacle. Aunts, uncles, and second cousins were clustered in small groups, whispering in hushed tones. These were the same people who had ignored my college graduation and skipped my professional promotions, but who had eagerly shown up to witness my manufactured downfall. I saw my uncle from Topeka, a man who had borrowed money from my grandfather and never repaid it, shaking his head in mock sympathy as he listened to my sister Bethany. Bethany stood at the center of the crowd, wearing a designer dress paid for by our parents, holding court with the practiced grace of a seasoned politician. She was selling the tragedy of the broken sister, a role she had rehearsed since we were children. Growing up, Bethany was the undisputed star of the household, a pageant queen who commanded attention while I faded into the background, calculating grocery budgets and organizing tax receipts for my father. Now she was using my lifetime of quiet diligence as evidence of my isolation and instability. I walked past the gathered relatives, refusing to lower my gaze. The whispers died down as I approached the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. They expected me to look defeated, holding back tears of panic. Instead, I offered them the cold, blank stare of a financial manager reviewing a bankrupt ledger. I was standing near the drinking fountain, reviewing a hard copy of the case docket, when my mother detached herself from the crowd. Diane approached me with her hands clasped together, her face contorted into a mask of profound maternal suffering. She wore her best Sunday church outfit, a pale blue suit that communicated innocence and propriety to anyone who did not know her true nature. I recognized the performance instantly. She was playing to the gallery, ensuring that every relative in the hallway saw her making a desperate, loving attempt to reach her troubled daughter. She murmured my name, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the spectators. She claimed they were so worried about my health and begged me to let them help end this nightmare. She reached out, extending her hand to grasp my forearm. The gesture was designed to force a physical connection, to trap me in a display of familial affection that I would look unhinged for rejecting. It was the same tactic she used at church functions when I was a teenager, pinching my arm to keep me smiling while feeding lies to the congregation. I did not blink. I took one deliberate step backward, entirely removing myself from her physical reach. I left her hand hanging in the empty space between us, a visual representation of the boundary I had permanently established. I told her I was perfectly fine and suggested she save the theatrics for the judge. My voice echoed with the sterile professionalism of a bank audit offering zero emotional traction for her to exploit. Her hand dropped to her side and the veneer of maternal concern vanished, revealing the brittle, panicked reality underneath. Her jaw clenched and her eyes darted toward the watching family members to see if they had witnessed the rejection. They had seen everything. The picture of the caring mother trying to soothe her erratic child shattered instantly, replaced by the image of a woman whose authority had been publicly dismissed. I turned my back on her, feeling a profound sense of liberation. The days of letting them touch me to manipulate the narrative were completely over. Before Diane could attempt another tactic, the heavy glass doors at the end of the hallway swung open, and Marcus Thorne made his entrance. The attorney strode down the corridor with an arrogant swagger that demanded the floor. He carried a slim leather portfolio projecting an aura of total invincibility. He did not look like a man preparing for a complex trial. He looked like a man arriving to collect a very large paycheck. He walked straight past me without a glance and joined my parents. I watched closely as he lifted his wrist, checking his expensive gold watch with a theatrical sigh. He told my father that he had another filing across town by noon and that they needed to push the judge for a rapid summary judgment. Thorne was fully anticipating a swift surrender. He truly believed he could walk into the courtroom, recite a few scripted concerns about my stability, and walk out an hour later with total control of my grandfather's immense estate. His arrogance was his greatest vulnerability. He had not bothered to prepare for a genuine legal battle because he had bought into the lies my parents had fed him. He assumed I was a frightened, isolated girl who would crumble the moment the judge asked a difficult question. He did not know that Elias and I possessed the irrevocable trust document securely stored in the briefcase resting near my feet. He did not know about the audio recording or the extensive financial ledgers detailing his client's massive outstanding debts. Thorne was operating on a contingency fee, relying entirely on a quick victory to fund his lavish lifestyle. If this case dragged on, or if his clients were proven to be committing perjury, his own financial situation would become precarious. He needed a fast capitulation to avoid bankrupting his own small practice on thousands of hours of unpaid litigation. His impatience was a weapon I fully intended to use against him. I looked at Elias and offered a slight nod. My attorney smiled a small, tight expression of absolute readiness, recognizing that our opponents had blinded themselves with their own hubris. The hallway felt suddenly claustrophobic as the tension reached a boiling point. My father paced back and forth near the courtroom entrance, muttering to Thorne about ensuring the asset transfer happened by Friday. Silas was already spending money that did not belong to him, planning his financial rescue on the back of my manufactured destruction. I watched him smooth his tie, his face a portrait of unearned confidence. It was a staggering display of cognitive dissonance. They had convinced themselves that their greed was actually an act of salvation, justifying their theft under the guise of parental intervention. The air was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and expensive perfume, a chaotic mixture that perfectly mirrored the fake high society image my family tried to project. I grounded myself in the physical reality of the moment, focusing on the texture of my leather portfolio and the steady rhythm of my breathing. I was the architect of my own defense, and every piece of structural support was locked firmly into place. The bailiff stepped out of the courtroom and announced that Judge Harrison was ready to call the docket. The murmurs in the hallway ceased entirely. The extended family moved toward the wooden benches inside, eager to watch the destruction of my independence. My parents walked through the doors first, followed closely by Thorne, who was still adjusting his suit jacket and checking his phone screen for messages. They were marching straight into a canyon they believed to be empty, completely unaware of the avalanche waiting above them. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit, picked up my leather bag, and followed them inside. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind me, sealing us all in the arena where the truth could no longer be hidden by polite Midwestern smiles. The game of intimidation had officially ended, and the business of justice was about to begin. The interior of the Sedgwick County Courthouse felt like the inside of a bank vault. The walls were paneled in dark walnut, and the air carried a sterile chill that smelled of floor polish and old paper. I sat at the defense table beside Elias, keeping my posture rigid, and my hands folded neatly over my legal pad. Behind us, the gallery hummed with the hushed whispers of my extended family. They had arrived in droves, expecting to watch a swift legal execution. I kept my eyes fixed on the empty bench at the front of the room, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a backward glance. My heartbeat remained slow and steady, measuring the seconds with the precision of a ticking clock. This proceeding was no longer simply about protecting financial assets. It was a terminal breach of family honor, a line drawn in the Kansas dirt that could never be uncrossed. The heavy wooden door beside the bench swung open, and Judge Harrison entered the room. She was a woman known throughout the district for running a strict timeline. She wore her black robe like a suit of armor, projecting an aura of someone who despised theatricality and preferred the cold arithmetic of the law. She took her seat, arranged her files with deliberate movements, and called the docket. Her voice was flat and authoritative, leaving no room for courtroom dramatics. She looked down at the assembled lawyers and demanded that the plaintiffs present their opening arguments without wasting the court's valuable time. Marcus Thorne stood up, adjusting the lapels of his expensive navy suit. He approached the podium with the swagger of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. He began his opening statement by painting a tragic portrait of a fractured family. He used phrases like necessary intervention and psychological decline. He argued that my parents were merely acting as concerned guardians, stepping in to save a successful young professional who had buckled under the severe stress of managing corporate wealth. It was a slick narrative designed to sound compassionate while laying the groundwork for total financial control. He claimed to represent the best interests of a distressed woman who could no longer distinguish between sound investments and reckless endangerment. My father Silas was the first to take the stand. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth without a single tremor of hesitation. He settled into the wooden witness chair and adopted a sorrowful tone. He spoke about his late father, claiming they had shared a close, unbreakable bond and that he was only trying to protect the inheritance from my erratic choices. He told the court that I had grown isolated and paranoid due to the relentless demands of my career. He lied smoothly, leaving out the years of emotional distance and the fact that he had rarely visited the farm during the final decade of the old man's life. I sat motionless, noting every fabricated detail on my legal pad. Elias watched him with the patient gaze of a predator tracking a wounded animal. Diane followed her husband to the witness stand. She was the architect of our family dynamics, and she knew exactly how to play the grieving mother for an audience. She brought a lace handkerchief with her, gripping it tightly in her manicured hands. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes, being careful not to ruin her makeup while she testified. She told Judge Harrison that it broke her heart to take legal action against her own flesh and blood. Then she pivoted to attacking my grandfather. She claimed the old man had been wandering the fields confused and vulnerable to manipulation during his last year of life. She suggested that I had taken advantage of his declining mental state to secure my position as the primary executor. The perjury flowed from her lips with effortless grace, turning a man of profound stoicism into a helpless victim. I allowed my gaze to drift briefly toward the gallery directly behind the plaintiff table. My sister Bethany sat in the front row, wearing a tailored dress that looked brand new. Bethany had spent her entire life operating as the designated center of attention. When we were younger, she once faked a severe asthma attack on the morning of my regional math competition, just to ensure our parents stayed home with her. She fed on the disruption of my achievements. She caught me looking at her. A slow, victorious smirk spread across her face. She tilted her head slightly, a silent gesture of triumph. She truly believed the trial was already over. She thought the sheer volume of our parents' fabricated tears would easily wash away any defense I could mount. I did not frown or glare. I simply held her eyes with the vacant, unblinking stare of a financial auditor reviewing a fraudulent return. Her smile faltered just a fraction before she turned her attention back to the judge, unnerved by my total lack of submission. Thorne returned to the center of the floor, eager to capitalize on the emotional momentum his clients had generated. He leaned heavily on the concept of fiduciary peril, arguing that the court had a moral obligation to protect the estate from my unstable grip. He waved a thin manila folder in the air, claiming it contained preliminary filings that illustrated a clear pattern of risk. He spoke of preserving the legacy of a hardworking Kansas farmer from ruin. He assumed the judge was moved by the performance because her face remained a mask of sheer neutrality. Judge Harrison did not nod or frown. She simply watched him speak, her pen resting motionless on her desk. Thorne mistook her silence for agreement, and his chest swelled with unearned confidence. He prepared to ask for an immediate summary ruling to transfer control of the accounts to my parents. Judge Harrison raised a single index finger, silencing the attorney mid-sentence. She leaned forward, peering over the rims of her reading glasses. She stated that the court had heard enough emotional testimony regarding family dynamics. She wanted to deal with the tangible assets. She demanded that Thorne present the actual estate records he kept referencing to validate his client's position. Thorne offered a polished smile, assuming she meant the standard probate inventory forms he had submitted with the initial petition. He told the court he had the preliminary asset estimates ready for her immediate review. The judge shook her head sharply. She clarified her demand, stating she required the comprehensive final asset logs and the originating ownership documents executed by the deceased. She wanted the hard proof of how the estate was legally structured prior to death, not estimations drawn up by a third party trying to gain access. Thorne hesitated, his confident facade slipping for the briefest moment. He had not subpoenaed the complete private financial architecture because Silas and Diane had assured him the assets were unshielded and ripe for the taking. He began to stammer an excuse about requesting an extension for formal discovery so his team could gather the appropriate paperwork. Elias stood up, his movements smooth and unhurried. He slid a thick leather-bound portfolio across our table and addressed the bench. My attorney informed the court that the defense possessed the exact origin records Her Honor was requesting. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The trap was laid open, and Judge Harrison extended her hand toward the bailiff, instructing him to bring the documents to the bench. The bailiff took the heavy leather portfolio from my attorney and carried it up the short steps to the elevated mahogany bench. Marcus Thorne watched the exchange with a tight jaw. Desperate to reclaim the momentum he had lost, he approached the podium and pushed his own thin folder forward. He told the judge that his file contained my recent financial statements and work schedules. He insisted that his collection of data would prove I was an overworked and insolvent woman, unfit to manage a vast agricultural and financial estate. He expected his curated timeline to validate his client's position and secure the rapid victory he needed to collect his contingency fee. Judge Harrison ignored his offering. She opened the thick portfolio Elias had provided and smoothed the first page flat against her desk. The courtroom grew so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system. The silence transformed into a heavy physical presence pressing down on the gallery. The only sound was the crisp turning of thick parchment paper as the judge read. She stopped reading. Her gaze dropped to the bottom of the first page. She flipped to the second page, then the third, tracing a line of text with her silver pen. Her expression shifted from neutral observation to sharp, unyielding scrutiny. She lowered the document and fixed her eyes directly on Marcus Thorne. "Counsel, are you aware of the date on this originating document?" she asked. The question rang through the courtroom with the striking force of a hammered bell. Thorne froze. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. At the plaintiff table, my father turned to look at my mother. His brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Diane stared back at him. Her meticulously painted lips parted in silent panic. They had no idea what file the judge was referencing. They had built their entire lawsuit on assumptions, rather than evidence, assuming the estate was simply waiting in a standard probate account for the next of kin to claim it. My father always believed he was the smartest man in Kansas. Growing up, I watched him mock my grandfather's methodical farming practices. Silas would call the old man slow and outdated, preferring the fast leverage of bank loans and quick returns over the steady labor of tending the soil. Grandpa Silas used to tell him that a house built on borrowed dirt belongs to the wind. My father never listened to that wisdom. He viewed patience as a weakness. Now that same arrogance left him sitting paralyzed in a court of law, unmoored from reality. Thorne finally stammered an excuse, attempting to guess the nature of the paperwork. He suggested it might be an outdated will or a voided contract draft. He reached his hand forward as if to take the document, but Judge Harrison kept her palm flat against the paper, denying him access. Elias rose from his chair beside me. His movements were smooth and purposeful, devoid of the theatricality Thorne relied upon. He requested permission to guide the court through the specific clauses of the provided text. Judge Harrison offered a single sharp nod. Elias explained that the document in her hands was a certified certificate of irrevocable trust. He directed her attention to Section 4, subsection B. Thorne objected, his voice rising in sudden panic. He claimed the defense was attempting to introduce unverified records without proper discovery. Judge Harrison overruled him instantly, noting the presence of a notarized state seal and the signature of a recognized Kansas trust officer. Elias read the clause aloud for the court record. He detailed how my grandfather had deliberately sealed the entirety of his assets into a trust that designated me as the sole autonomous beneficiary. He pointed out the exclusionary clauses written with surgical precision. The language explicitly forbade Silas and Diane from ever acting as trustees, conservators, or financial proxies under any circumstances. The trust document stated that no biological relative could override my financial authority, regardless of my marital status or alleged mental capacity. Thorne looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to pull him under. He realized in that exact second that he had been fighting a war over a territory that had already been conquered and fortified. The reality of the trust hit the room like a physical shockwave. Elias revealed the execution date, highlighting the detail that brought my parents' scheme crashing to the floor. The trust was established, funded, and legally sealed 8 months before my grandfather passed away. This was not a deathbed decision made by a confused old man suffering from cognitive decline. This was a calculated, deliberate act of protection executed while Grandpa Silas was in perfect health and of exceptionally sound mind. The parents' entire narrative of a sudden manipulative cash grab orchestrated by an unstable daughter dissolved into dust right in front of the judge. The gallery behind me erupted into a chaotic symphony of whispers and gasps. The extended family members who had arrived ready to watch a rebellious daughter be stripped of her wealth suddenly understood they were witnessing a masterclass in defensive strategy. My uncles and cousins leaned forward, straining to hear the details of the trust that had outsmarted the slick city lawyer. They realized that the old farmer they had often dismissed as simple had possessed the foresight to legally lock his legacy away from his own greedy son. The dynamic in the room inverted. The whispering grew louder until the bailiff had to call for order. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to turn around and look at my sister Bethany or the rest of the gallery. I did not need to see their faces to know what they were feeling. The foundation of their perceived superiority had been ripped away. My parents sat frozen at their table. All the color had drained from my father's face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. Diane gripped the edge of the wooden table, her knuckles turning white as she struggled to process the magnitude of their failure. They had committed perjury under oath, ruined their standing in the community, and spent money they did not have on a contingency lawyer, all for an estate they legally could not touch. They had walked into the courthouse expecting a swift victory built on my supposed weakness. They failed to realize that my silence over the past few weeks was not the silence of a frightened child, but the focused quiet of a financial manager reviewing a flawless balance sheet. I had let them talk, I had let them lie, and I had let them build their false narrative, because I knew the documents in Elias' portfolio would act as a wrecking ball against their house of cards. The tension in the courtroom shifted from an aggressive assault on my character to a suffocating realization of their own ruin. I felt the steady rhythm of my heartbeat anchoring me to the present moment. The trap had sprung shut, and the people who thought they were the hunters were now staring at the iron bars closing around them. I watched the judge lower her reading glasses, preparing to address the plaintiffs, and I knew the consequences of their actions were about to be delivered with the blunt force of Kansas law. The air in the courtroom grows incredibly stale as the magistrate finishes her review. She lowers the thick parchment and looks directly at the plaintiff table. This trust, Judge Harrison declares, her voice echoing against the dark walnut panels, grants Verity Alcott complete sole and irrevocable control over the entirety of the estate. Furthermore, it expressly prohibits any conservatorship claim by the parents or any other biological relative. The words land with the heavy finality of a steel vault slamming shut. The legal phrasing is not a mere suggestion. It is an impenetrable fortress constructed by a man who foresaw exactly this kind of treachery. I watch my father process the statement. Silas has spent his entire adult life operating under the assumption that volume equals authority. He is a man who used his booming voice to intimidate loan officers and silence his wife at the dinner table. He cannot comprehend a reality where a piece of paper holds more power than his own ego. The blood rushes to his face, turning his skin a mottled shade of crimson. He stands up, pushing his heavy wooden chair back so forcefully it screeches against the polished floorboards. He points a trembling finger at my attorney and shouts that the document is a fabrication. He screams that it is a forgery, a desperate lie manufactured by a greedy daughter to steal his rightful inheritance. His voice cracks, echoing off the high ceilings, stripping away the last remnants of his dignified facade. Marcus Thorne sits frozen in his chair. The shark has suddenly realized he is bleeding in his own tank. Contingency lawyers build their practice on a foundation of calculated risk, relying on their clients to provide accurate financial landscapes. Thorne took this case believing the assets were unprotected and ripe for extraction because Silas and Diane had sworn there was no estate planning in place. They had lied to him. They had weaponized his predatory nature without giving him the actual facts, and now he is standing in front of a highly respected judge holding a frivolous lawsuit based on perjury. The color drains from his face. He looks at my parents not with the protective stance of legal counsel, but with the pure venom of a man who realizes he has just performed hundreds of hours of unpaid labor for two desperate frauds. Silas refuses to stop shouting. His entitlement overrides whatever survival instincts he has left. He demands to see the trust stepping away from the plaintiff table and moving directly toward the bench. It is a staggering display of arrogance. He truly believes the rules of the court do not apply to him. He lunges forward, attempting to snatch the certified document right out of the judge's hands. The reaction is instantaneous. The bailiff, a towering man with a quiet but commanding presence, steps firmly into my father's path. The officer places a heavy hand against Silas's chest, halting his forward momentum with blunt physical force. The bailiff issues a low, stern warning, ordering him to step back immediately or face physical restraint. My father blinks, looking at the officer's hand on his tailored suit, as if he cannot fathom being denied. He is physically neutralized, forced to retreat to his side of the room, while the entire gallery watches his humiliating display of aggression. Judge Harrison slams her wooden gavel down, producing a crack that sounds like a gunshot. The sharp noise cuts through the remaining chaos, demanding total obedience. She leans over the elevated bench, her eyes burning with a cold judicial fury. She threatens Silas with immediate incarceration for contempt of court if he speaks another word out of turn. She tells him that attempting to physically grab evidence from the bench is an offense that carries a mandatory holding period in the county jail. My father finally shrinks, folding into his chair like a deflated balloon. Diane reaches out to touch his arm, but he yanks it away, staring blankly at the floor. The united front they tried to project has shattered, leaving two isolated people drowning in the consequences of their own deception. Thorne attempts to salvage his own professional reputation. He stands up, keeping his hands visible, and open a gesture of surrender. He addresses the court, claiming he had zero prior knowledge of the irrevocable trust. He stammers that his clients willfully withheld this vital information during their initial consultations. He is formally throwing my parents under the bus, severing his ethical ties to their sinking ship to save his own license. Judge Harrison listens to his frantic explanation with a look of pure disgust. She informs Thorne that his failure to conduct proper discovery does not excuse him from bringing a fraudulent claim into her jurisdiction. She directs him to sit down and remains silent while she delivers her ruling. The room holds its collective breath. I sit perfectly still, my hands resting on my leather portfolio. I am witnessing the exact return on investment I calculated weeks ago. The judge adjusts her microphone and begins to speak for the official record. She states that the plaintiffs have presented a case entirely devoid of factual merit. She notes that the existence of the trust not only invalidates their claim for conservatorship, but actively exposes their petition as a bad faith maneuver designed to subvert the explicitly documented wishes of the deceased. The judge declares that the lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. The phrase hangs in the air, bringing a profound sense of finality. Dismissed with prejudice means the door is permanently locked. They can never bring this case before a court again. They have fired their only bullet and missed the target. Judge Harrison is not finished. She looks directly at Silas and Diane, her expression devoid of any sympathy. She notes that the defense has endured significant emotional and professional harassment due to this baseless litigation. She suggests that the court is highly inclined to entertain a motion for sanctions against the plaintiffs. She explicitly states that Silas and Diane may be held fully liable for my entire legal bill alongside potential punitive damages for wasting the court's resources. The financial implications hit my parents like a physical blow. They came into this courtroom expecting to walk away with a windfall to rescue their mismanaged suburban lifestyle. Instead, they are walking out with their reputations destroyed, a potential malpractice dispute with their own furious attorney, and a looming financial penalty that could easily bankrupt them. They intended to seize my wealth, and now they are going to pay for the privilege of losing. I look at my attorney, Elias. He offers a slow, satisfied nod. The strategy was flawless. We did not just win the case, we exposed the fundamental bankruptcy of their character. I turn my head slightly to observe the gallery behind me. The extended family members are dead silent, their faces registering the shock of the reversal. My sister Bethany is staring at the floor, her designer dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The golden child has finally realized that the parents who funded her lifestyle are entirely out of capital. The narrative she fed on is dead. I gather my documents, placing them neatly back into my briefcase. I do not feel the urge to gloat or celebrate. I feel the clean, efficient satisfaction of a completed audit. The liabilities have been neutralized, and the assets are secure. The judge calls for a brief recess before moving to the next docket item. The bailiff opens the side doors, signaling that we are free to leave. Thorne is already shoving his legal pads into his briefcase, refusing to look at his clients. He snaps the lock shut and storms down the center aisle, abandoning Silas and Diane at the table. My parents sit there isolated and exposed, waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. I stand up, buttoning my charcoal suit jacket, preparing to make my exit. The storm they tried to bring to my doorstep has broken over their own heads. I step out from behind the defense table, ready to walk through the crowd that once doubted me. The legal battle is officially over, but the social fallout in the hallway is just beginning, and I am ready to walk right through it. The sound of the heavy wooden gavel striking the sounding block acted as a release valve for the entire room. The gallery, which had been holding its collective breath during the judge's brutal final remarks, erupted into a chaotic symphony of overlapping voices. The extended family members who had spent the morning whispering malicious rumors against my character were now staring at my parents with unvarnished disgust. The social mask of the concerned guardians had been shredded into unrecognizable pieces. Silas and Diane sat frozen at the plaintiff table, surrounded by the wreckage of their own perjury. Their hired attorney had already vanished down the corridor, leaving them to face the firing squad of their peers alone. I did not smile. I did not pump my fist or offer a gloating remark. I simply closed the clasp on my leather briefcase. The sensation washing over me was not a fiery triumph, but a deep, quiet relief. The wolves were gone. I had protected the final wishes of Grandpa Silas, and in doing so, I had permanently freed myself from the gravitational pull of their toxicity. I turned toward the center aisle. The gathered relatives parted for me like water yielding to the prow of a ship. My uncle, who had previously shaken his head in mock sympathy, now stared at the floor, unable to meet my eye. Bethany was nowhere to be seen. The golden child had apparently recognized the shift in power and fled the scene before she could be associated with the losing side. I walked past the wooden pews, feeling the solid rhythm of my own footsteps. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the corridor. Elias walked beside me, matching my measured pace. He offered a firm handshake near the security checkpoint, congratulating me on maintaining my composure under direct fire. I thanked him, and we agreed to speak later that afternoon regarding the motion for legal sanctions. I continued toward the exit, alone feeling the sudden vastness of my own future. The crisp Kansas air hit my face as I walked down the wide stone steps of the courthouse. The bruised purple sky from the morning had cleared, leaving a brilliant, harsh sunlight that illuminated every crack in the pavement. I headed toward my vehicle parked in the adjacent lot, eager to return to the quiet sanctuary of my office. I had a quarterly financial review to prepare for my firm, and the prospect of looking at clean, honest numbers felt like a balm to my weary mind. My hand was reaching for the door handle when I heard the frantic clicking of heels on the asphalt, followed by the heavy scuffing of men's dress shoes. "Verity, wait, please just wait a minute." The voice belonged to Silas, but the tone was entirely foreign. The booming authoritarian cadence he had utilized for 29 years was gone, replaced by the thin, reedy pitch of a desperate man. I turned around slowly, resting my hand against the cold metal of my car door. My parents were hurrying across the parking lot, looking disheveled and frantic. Diane had abandoned her posture of maternal suffering. Her makeup was genuinely smeared, and her breathing was ragged. They stopped a few feet away from me, panting in the cold air. "We need to talk," Silas said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "This whole situation, it got so far out of hand. The lawyers pushed us. They told us things that were not true. We just wanted to make sure you were safe. We need some family time to sit down and sort this out privately." The phrase family time hung in the frigid air. It was a weaponized term in our household. Whenever Silas committed an egregious error, he deployed that exact phrase to force our compliance. When I was 17, he drained the modest savings account I had built, working at a local grocery store, claiming he needed it to cover a temporary shortfall in his business. When I discovered the theft, he bought a cheap grocery store cake, gathered us in the dining room, and declared it was time for family time. The unspoken rule was that during these mandated gatherings, all grievances were erased, and anyone who brought up the transgression was accused of ruining the peace. He was trying to run the exact same play right now in a courthouse parking lot after attempting to steal an entire estate. I looked at him, and the sheer absurdity of his request crystallized in my mind. He was asking the financial manager who had just dismantled his legal strategy in federal court to revert back to the silent teenager who accepted grocery store cake as an apology for theft. Diane stepped forward, reaching a trembling hand toward my sleeve. "Verity, please, sweetheart," she pleaded. "We are your parents. We love you. You cannot just walk away from us like this. Think of the community. Think of the church. How are we going to explain this?" She was not weeping for the loss of her daughter. She was mourning the death of her social currency. She was already calculating the whispers in the grocery store aisles and the averted glances at her weekly charity luncheons. She wanted me to sit down and craft a mutual narrative that would save her reputation. She wanted me to absorb the damage so she could continue to pretend she was a flawless matriarch. I stepped back, ensuring she could not touch my clothing. "You are not going to explain anything, Diane. The public record will do the explaining for you." Silas stepped closer, his face tight with a rising panic. "You cannot do this, Verity. The judge is talking about sanctions. She is talking about making us pay your legal fees. We do not have that kind of liquidity. You know we are struggling. If you push this, you will ruin us. You have the trust now. You have everything. Just call your lawyer off and let us go home." He was finally telling the truth, but he was using it as a bargaining chip. He was demanding grace from the very person he had spent months trying to destroy. I watched the Kansas wind ruffle the collar of his expensive suit. I felt no anger. I felt no desire to yell or debate the nuances of their betrayal. Engaging in an argument would only validate their delusion that we were still a family capable of having a dispute. We were no longer a family. We were two opposing entities in a finalized transaction. I opened my leather portfolio and retrieved a small rectangular piece of heavy cardstock. It was Elias' business card printed with his direct office line and email address. I held it out, holding it steady between my index and middle fingers. Silas looked at the small piece of paper as if it were a venomous snake. He did not reach for it. "Take the card, Silas," I instructed, my voice dropping to a low, steady register. He slowly extended his hand and took the card from my grasp. "From this moment forward," I said, looking directly into his eyes, "you do not have a daughter. You have opposing counsel. If you wish to discuss the payment of my legal fees, the terms of the court sanctions, or the timeline for your financial restitution, you will call that number. If you attempt to contact my personal phone if you show up at my apartment, or if you approach my place of employment, Elias will file a restraining order before the sun sets." Diane let out a sharp, strangled sob, covering her mouth with both hands. Silas stared at the business card, his shoulders slumping as the finality of the boundary settled over him. He opened his mouth to speak, but he had no script for a scenario where his authority was rendered entirely obsolete. I turned away, opening my car door and sliding into the driver's seat. I started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through the steering wheel. I rolled up the window, sealing the cabin against the cold air and the sound of my mother's crying. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the parking space. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I drove toward the exit. Silas and Diane were standing alone on the expanse of gray asphalt, growing smaller and smaller with every passing second. They looked like two strangers lost in a city they no longer recognized. I merged onto the highway, heading back toward my office in Wichita. The horizon stretched out before me, wide and unobstructed. The performance was over. The stage had been dismantled. I had walked into that courthouse carrying the heavy burden of my childhood, and I was driving away, holding only the keys to my own future. The Midwestern sky felt remarkably clear, and for the first time in 29 years, the silence in my life was not a punishment, but a profound and beautiful reward. I pressed the accelerator, knowing the hardest part of the journey was behind me, and the work I was truly meant to do was just beginning. The weeks following the court dismissal brought a profound silence to my life in Wichita. It was not the oppressive quiet of a house filled with unspoken resentment, which I had endured throughout my childhood, but the clean, expansive stillness of a Kansas prairie after a violent storm. I returned to my office at the financial firm the very next morning. My colleagues treated me with a renewed layer of professional deference. They did not pry into the details of the probate victory, but the subtle nods in the hallway communicated a deep respect. I had faced down a predatory lawsuit and emerged with my career and my capital entirely intact. I poured my energy back into my client portfolios, analyzing market trends and securing their futures with the same methodical discipline that had saved my own. The label of the spare child, the inadequate daughter who could never match the golden sister, was finally dead. I was a financial manager, operating at the height of my capabilities, and my life was now defined exclusively by the stoic honesty of my home state. Grandpa Silas had left behind an estate of significant magnitude. The trust granted me absolute authority over liquid capital, agricultural acreage, and diversified market investments. A less disciplined person might have immediately liquidated a portion of the portfolio to purchase a luxury vehicle or a sprawling suburban mansion. My parents certainly would have used the funds to upgrade their country club memberships and buy designer wardrobes to project an illusion of aristocratic wealth. I had no interest in accumulating depreciating status symbols. I understood that money is merely a tool, and its true value is determined by the architecture of its purpose. I spent my evenings sitting at my dining room table drafting a comprehensive legal charter. I used a substantial block of the liquid assets to establish a permanent endowment named the Silas Alcott Agricultural Scholarship. The scholarship was designed specifically for young farmers in the Midwest. I wrote the qualifying criteria with Grandpa in mind, targeting individuals who demonstrated a commitment to sustainable soil management and possessed the grit required to weather brutal harvest seasons. I wanted to fund the education of people who understood that a fence line requires maintenance and that true wealth is pulled from the earth through blistered hands. I appointed a board of directors comprising local agricultural science professors and community bankers, ensuring the funds would be managed with absolute transparency for generations. Signing the final incorporation documents brought a profound sense of closure. I was taking the wealth my parents tried to steal for their own vanity and planting it directly back into the Kansas soil. I had successfully preserved the legacy of the only man who ever truly believed in my potential. My newfound equilibrium was interrupted on a Tuesday evening when I checked my residential mailbox. Wedged between a stack of utility bills and financial periodicals was a pale pink envelope. The stationery was thick and expensive, emitting a faint trace of floral perfume. I recognized the looping cursive handwriting immediately. It belonged to Diane. Despite the explicit warning I had issued in the courthouse parking lot, my mother had bypassed my attorney and sent a physical piece of mail directly to my home. I stood in the foyer of my apartment holding the envelope. The paper felt heavy, acting as a tangible anchor trying to drag me back into a sea of emotional manipulation. I walked into my living room and sat on the edge of the sofa. I did not want to open it, but the analytical part of my brain required me to assess the threat level. I slid my index finger under the flap and broke the wax seal. The letter was 2 pages long, written in her immaculate penmanship. I braced myself for a barrage of insults or a desperate plea for financial assistance. What I read was far more insidious. Diane had crafted a masterpiece of psychological deflection. She did not apologize for attempting to seize my inheritance. She did not acknowledge the perjury she committed on the witness stand or the malicious lies she had spread to our extended family. Instead, she wrote to tell me that she was choosing the path of grace. She stated that she and my father had prayed extensively and decided to forgive me for the pain I had caused the family by winning the lawsuit. She claimed my defensive legal tactics had broken her heart, but that a mother's love is unconditional. She ended the letter by suggesting that whenever I was ready to apologize for tearing the family apart, the door to their home would be open. The audacity of the letter was staggering. She was attempting to rewrite history, casting herself as the benevolent victim and me as the ruthless aggressor. Growing up, Diane frequently weaponized the concept of forgiveness to maintain her authority. When my dyslexia caused me to fail a spelling test in the 3rd grade, she told me she forgave me for embarrassing her in front of the teacher. When I chose to study finance instead of joining her social clubs, she forgave me for lacking refined taste. Her forgiveness was never a bridge to reconciliation. It was a chain designed to bind me to a perpetual state of guilt. She was trying to slip that chain around my neck one last time. The conflict crystallized in my mind. The old version of Verity, the desperate spare child, would have internalized this letter. I would have spent hours drafting a response, trying to logically explain why she was wrong, hoping to finally make her understand my perspective. I would have allowed her delusional narrative to infect my self-worth and drain my energy. But the woman sitting in the living room was an elite asset manager who understood how to recognize a bad investment. Engaging with her delusion would yield zero returns. It would only provide her with the attention she craved. I stood up and carried the pale pink pages to the brick fireplace in the corner of my apartment. The hearth was cold, containing only the remnants of ash from a fire I had built weeks ago. I knelt on the hardwood floor and placed the 2 pages of expensive stationery onto the grate. I reached for the long wooden matches resting on the mantel. I struck the match against the abrasive strip, listening to the sharp hiss as the sulfur ignited into a bright orange flame. I held the fire to the corner of the letter. The thick paper resisted for a brief second before catching the heat. The flame crawled across the looping cursive script, turning her words of fake grace into black curling ribbons. I watched the fire consume the word forgive and then the word family. The floral perfume she had sprayed on the envelope evaporated into the smell of wood smoke and burnt carbon. I did not feel a trace of sadness. I felt a tremendous physical release radiating through my chest and shoulders. I watched until the entire letter was reduced to a pile of gray ash. The fire flickered and died, leaving the hearth dark once again. I took the brass poker and crushed the fragile remains into dust, ensuring no legible fragment survived. I had destroyed her final attempt to influence my reality. The chapter of my life where I allowed Silas and Diane to dictate my value was officially closed. I stood up and washed the scent of smoke from my hands, feeling entirely cleansed. I walked toward the window and looked out at the city, recognizing that the emotional war was finally over. The only task remaining was to secure my own estate, ensuring that the fortress I had defended would stand impenetrable long after I was gone. I steer my car onto the narrow gravel road that leads directly to the original Alcott property. The heavy tires crunch against the crushed white limestone, creating a steady rhythmic sound that easily drowns out the lingering noise of the city traffic I left behind an hour ago. The sun is beginning its final descent over the vast Kansas plains, casting a brilliant golden light that turns the endless fields of dormant winter wheat into a glowing sea of amber. I park my vehicle near the weathered wooden barn, cut the engine, and step out into the sharp, cooling evening air. The wind sweeps across the flat, unobstructed expanse, carrying the rich, familiar scent of dry earth and impending frost. I walk toward the sturdy wooden fence line Grandpa Silas and I spent an entire summer repairing during my senior year of high school. I rest my hands on the rough timber, feeling the deep grooves worn into the wood by decades of harsh weather. I am Verity Alcott. I manage wealth for a living, evaluating the calculated risk and the projected return of every financial transaction that crosses my desk. Standing here looking at the physical land that secured my independence, I understand that the true cost of a peaceful life is measured in the quiet boundaries you are willing to defend. 6 months have passed since the county judge brought her gavel down and dismissed my parents' fraudulent lawsuit with prejudice. The quiet rhythm of my daily routine has returned, but the financial reality of my parents' situation unraveled with an astonishing and brutal speed. They had spent several decades building a fragile facade of suburban prosperity funded entirely by high-interest credit lines and multiple secondary mortgages. They operated under the arrogant assumption that they would eventually use my grandfather's estate to balance their reckless ledgers and fund their retirement. When the judge permanently locked that door, the creditors simply stopped waiting for their money. I received a phone call yesterday afternoon from my cousin David. He was the only relative who had maintained a respectful, objective distance during the entire trial, refusing to participate in the gossip network my mother had tried to orchestrate. His voice carried a mixture of profound shock and quiet pity as he delivered the latest update on the family dynamic. Silas and Diane had officially lost the sprawling colonial house in Wichita. The regional bank initiated foreclosure proceedings after they missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments. The local sheriff arrived to oversee the eviction, and they were forced to rapidly liquidate their luxury vehicles. They held a humiliating estate sale to auction off the expensive antique furniture my mother had routinely used as elegant props for her high society charity luncheons. The public standing they had sacrificed their own daughter to protect vanished over the course of a single afternoon, leaving them with nothing but cardboard boxes and a ruined credit score. David hesitated on the line before sharing the final piece of news, anticipating a reaction of sympathy that I simply no longer possessed. He informed me that my sister Bethany, the designated golden child, who had never held a position more demanding than a part-time receptionist, was now the sole financial provider for the household. Silas and Diane had burned through their remaining cash reserves and were unemployable due to their age and complete lack of marketable skills. Bethany was forced to secure a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. To cover the monthly rent and the basic grocery bills, she had to take on a grueling day shift at a local discount retail outlet and immediately follow it with a night shift managing the floor at a loud chain restaurant. The profound irony of her situation hung in the air between us. Bethany, who had smirked at me from the courtroom gallery, assuming she was mere moments away from inheriting a fortune she did not earn, was now working 80 hours a week just to keep our parents from sliding into total destitution. The designer dresses she once flaunted were replaced by polyester uniform shirts smelling of deep fryer oil and retail floor wax. She was finally experiencing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the labor market, a concept our parents had shielded her from her entire life while expecting me to shoulder the burden of my own survival. David waited in silence, expecting me to express regret, or perhaps offer a modest financial concession to ease their sudden poverty. I offered neither. I thanked him for providing the factual update, wished his wife a pleasant weekend, and calmly ended the call. Sitting in my office looking out over the downtown skyline, I searched my chest for a flicker of malice vindication or even lingering anger regarding their downfall. I found a vast, empty space. The heavy resentment that used to occupy my mind was entirely gone. I did not hate my parents or my sister. I simply did not care about their trajectory anymore. That profound, unshakable indifference is the ultimate victory. They had demanded respect, financial salvation, and unconditional loyalty without ever doing the difficult work required to earn those things. Now they were experiencing the cold logic of the real world, a place where unearned entitlement holds zero market value. The news regarding Bethany and her grueling new reality served as a crucial strategic reminder. A defensive fortress is only secure if the architect actively maintains the perimeter walls. Grandpa Silas had successfully protected me from the wolves by utilizing his foresight, but I was now the sole custodian of the remaining estate. I had the agricultural scholarship functioning smoothly, generating reliable tuition funds for young Midwestern farmers, but my personal assets required attention. The significant capital I had built through my own rigorous career and the remaining trust funds required a permanent legal shield. I could not rely on the assumption that my parents or my sister would simply accept their defeat forever. Financial desperation breeds aggressive creativity. If an unexpected tragedy were to happen to me, the default laws of intestate succession could potentially hand the keys of my kingdom right back to the very people who tried to destroy my professional life. I left the farm the following morning and drove directly to the downtown legal district in Wichita. I scheduled a priority consultation with Elias arriving at his office before the administrative staff had even turned on the lobby lights. He greeted me in his corner suite, offering a cup of black coffee and a knowing, perceptive smile. He had seen the public foreclosure notices published in the county ledger the previous week. He knew exactly why I was sitting across from his desk. I opened my leather portfolio and handed him a preliminary draft of my own estate planning directives. I instructed my attorney to draw up a new irrevocable trust mirroring the precise legal architecture Grandpa Silas had utilized to save me. We spent 4 hours refining the specific clauses of the document, ensuring no linguistic loopholes remained. I named the agricultural endowment as the primary beneficiary of my estate, ensuring the wealth would continue to serve the Kansas farming community in perpetuity. I designated a secondary portion of the funds to establish a legal aid clinic for young adults facing financial abuse and coercive control from their legal guardians. Then I initiated the most decisive move of my entire life. I instructed Elias to draft a targeted disinheritance clause. It was a surgical paragraph that explicitly identified Silas, Diane, and Bethany by their full legal birth names. The document stated in clear, unassailable language that those three individuals were to receive absolutely nothing from my estate. Furthermore, they were legally prohibited from challenging the execution of the will under any pretense of familial right or alleged mental incapacity on my part. I included a secondary punitive provision dictating that if any of them attempted to contest the document, the formidable legal defense costs would be automatically drawn from a dedicated aggressive subaccount. This ensured my appointed executors would never hesitate to fight them in a courtroom because the funds to ruin them a second time were already secured and waiting. Elias reviewed the final printed pages, his silver pen hovering over the primary signature line. He looked across the polished table, noting the total lack of hesitation in my posture. He asked for the official record if I was certain about the severity of the permanent exclusion, reminding me that a document of this magnitude leaves zero room for future reconciliation. I looked him directly in the eye and stated that reconciliation requires two willing parties who share a mutual respect for the truth, a fundamental condition my family had proven entirely incapable of meeting. I picked up the heavy brass pen and signed my name on the thick parchment. The dark ink flowed smoothly, binding my intent to the paper with the same unbreakable weight of the Midwestern law that had saved me months prior. The notary stamped the pages, the heavy steel seal pressing the finality of the moment deep into the fiber of the document. I walked out of the law firm and stepped onto the busy sunlit sidewalk. The midday traffic hummed along the avenue, a steady stream of citizens going about the daily business of building their own lives. I felt a tremendous sense of lightness, a physical unburdening that permanently altered the way I carried my shoulders. I had closed the loop. The generational cycle of emotional extortion and financial exploitation was permanently broken. I walked toward my corporate office, ready to review the afternoon market reports with a clear and focused mind. My life belongs entirely to me. The wealth I manage, the peace I cultivate, and the future I build are the direct results of plain-speaking honesty and disciplined labor. I am Verity Alcott. I know the exact value of the legacy I hold, and I know with absolute certainty that true family is a privilege you earn through mutual respect rather than a right you can demand through a shared last name.
There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a house when the truth finally breaks through the walls of illusion. In America, we are often sold a very specific dream, a manicured lawn, a two-car garage, and a family portrait that looks perfect on a holiday card. But what happens when that portrait is merely a canvas stretched over a foundation of debt ego and quiet desperation? Verity's story is more than a courtroom drama about an inheritance. It is a profound, almost uncomfortable mirror reflecting the darkest corners of modern family dynamics. It asks us to look closely at the traditional American family structure and question the very roots of how we raise our children. It challenges us to examine the hidden costs of the expectations we place on the next generation. Let's talk about the first pillar of family life, the ethics of love and responsibility. In a society that heavily emphasizes individual success status and material gain, it is dangerously easy for parents to view their children as extensions of their own egos. Verity's parents, Silas and Diane, fell into this tragic trap. They did not see a daughter. They saw an asset. They viewed her as a safety net for their own financial failures, a retirement plan disguised as familial duty. This is the transactional nature of conditional love. A love that says, I will care for you, but only if you reflect well on me or serve my immediate needs. But true parenting grounded in emotional awareness and fundamental fairness requires the profound realization that our children do not belong to us. They come through us carrying their own destinies, their own struggles, and their own paths. When a mother or father tries to manipulate that path for personal gain, they don't just break a bond. They desecrate the sanctuary that a family is meant to be. The parents in this story turned their home into a battlefield of the ego, leaving Verity no choice but to build her own armor just to survive her childhood. Then there is the question of wisdom and the dangerous mirage of the material world. We live in a culture that often equates visible wealth with moral virtue. A sprawling colonial house in the suburbs is supposed to mean you are a good, responsible, and respectable person. But Verity's parents built their lives on the hollow ground of credit cards and desperate appearances. They suffered from a deep spiritual ignorance, believing that the accumulation of wealth, even if it had to be stolen from their own child, would somehow fix the gaping emptiness inside them. They completely ignored the most universal law of human existence, cause and effect. You cannot plant the seeds of deceit and expect to harvest a field of peace. Conversely, the grandfather Silas possessed true wisdom. He understood that the greatest legacy a parent or grandparent can leave is not merely a bank account, but a blueprint for integrity. He locked his wealth in an irrevocable trust, yes, but more importantly, he locked his core values into Verity's character. He taught her that true happiness does not lie in a designer label or a country club membership, but in the quiet, unshakable peace of a clean conscience and an honest day's work. We must also examine the pillar of fortitude, the sheer quiet strength required to be an honest person in a dishonest environment. Fortitude is often misunderstood in modern society as aggressive power or dominance. Verity's father thought he was strong because he yelled. Her mother thought she was strong because she manipulated the emotions of everyone around her. But true fortitude is the courage to look at your own mistakes, drop your ego, and take responsibility for your own life. Because her parents lacked this resilience, they chose the easy, cowardly route of trying to legally rob their daughter. Because they shielded her sister Bethany from the friction of the real world. Bethany lacked the fortitude to survive it, ultimately finding herself trapped in the bitter reality of minimum wage exhaustion to support her bankrupt parents. Verity, however, embodies an entirely different kind of strength, the fortitude of stillness. When the ultimate betrayal happened, she didn't scream. She didn't seek chaotic vengeance or engage in petty family drama. She used logic, boundaries, and the law. Her victory wasn't marked by gloating, but by a profound, empty release. It takes immense emotional strength to look at the people who gave you life, recognize their toxic influence, and peacefully, definitively close the door. Stories like Verity's resonate so deeply because they strip away the polite fictions we tell ourselves about family duty and unconditional love. They remind us that respect must be earned even within the confines of our own homes. If this journey of unmasking the truth, establishing boundaries, and reclaiming one's self-worth spoke to you, I invite you to subscribe and follow our channel, Still Drama Stories. We dive deep into the raw, unfiltered narratives of life, exploring the complexities of human relationships, the consequences of our choices, and the quiet victories of the human spirit. Join our community, share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue uncovering the profound lessons hidden in everyday drama. As we reflect on Verity standing in the quiet Kansas fields, breathing in the crisp air of her newly secured freedom, we are left to ponder our own legacies. The traditional American family is a beautiful concept, but it is not inherently sacred simply because it exists under one roof. It becomes sacred through the daily intentional practice of honesty, fairness, and unconditional respect. When the house is quiet and the guests have all gone home, what is truly left in the living room? Is it the warmth of genuine connection, or the cold, echoing silence of unspoken expectations and unpayable debts? We must deeply ask ourselves what we are truly passing down to our children. Are we giving them the deep roots of integrity and the strong wings of independence? Or are we handing them the heavy, invisible chains of our own unfulfilled desires? Somewhere right now, a child is watching their parents quietly learning exactly what love looks like, and we are left to wonder, when that child grows up and steps into their own power, will they pull a chair up to our table? Or will they, out of sheer survival, learn to walk away without ever looking back?